She's gone! The shark's got her! The scream tore across Peak Bay. Shirley Durdin had been snorkeling in waist-deep water. Her husband stood helpless on the beach, watching as a 20-foot great white erupted from the sea in a violent blur of muscle and teeth. One strike. She was bitten in half. Before anyone could react, the shark returned, consuming the rest of her body, right there, in front of her family. There was no rescue, no remains, just blood and silence. This is the story of one of the most horrific shark attacks ever witnessed, and the family left behind. It was supposed to be a perfect Sunday. The Durdin family had driven to Peak Bay, a quiet, remote stretch of South Australia's southern coastline. The kind of place where the only sounds are wind in the dunes, gulls overhead, and the gentle hush of the ocean brushing the shore. They weren't tourists. They lived nearby, in the port city of Whyalla. This wasn't an exotic getaway. It was a familiar spot, a routine weekend escape, a place where the kids could run barefoot and Shirley could gather scallops in the shallows, just as she'd done many times before. Her husband Barry watched from the beach. Their 4 children played nearby. It was warm, peaceful, unremarkable, until the ocean turned red. That's the part that haunts people the most. How ordinary the day had been. There were no warnings, no dorsal fins slicing the surface, no chance to shout, swim, or scream. It happened in silence, and in seconds. Shirley was snorkeling in just 6 or 7 feet of clear water, only meters from shore. Her upper body had broken the surface. She may have been about to lift her mask and wave back to her family. We'll never know. What followed was one of the most brutal and complete shark attacks ever witnessed. One moment, she was there. The next, she was gone. This isn't the story of a deep-sea diver drifting too far, or a thrill-seeker testing the limits. This is the story of a 33-year-old mother, doing something quiet, simple, and familiar, who died in front of the people who loved her most. Her children didn't just lose their mother. They saw her vanish into a spray of blood, swallowed by a predator that emerged without warning, and left without trace. What makes this story so devastating isn't just the violence. It's the context, the safety that was supposed to exist, the trust in nature, the belief that near the shoreline, with family around, nothing so terrible could happen. And yet, in March of 1985, something did. A creature older than history, stronger than steel, and perfectly adapted to kill in one strike, rose from the depths and took everything. What happened at Peak Bay stunned Australia, but beyond the headlines and horror lies a deeper story of grief, survival, and the raw, unpredictable power of nature. And as we look closer at that day, we begin to see how a moment of calm became one of the most terrifying true animal attacks ever recorded. Shirley Durdin wasn't famous. She didn't seek attention. She wasn't a thrill seeker or someone who pushed the limits of risk. She was a mother, a wife, a neighbor, a friend. Born and raised in South Australia, Shirley lived a life shaped by family, work, and routine. She was 33 years old. She and her husband Barry had 4 children together: Jason, Tanya, Carla, and little Sonia, the youngest at just 5. The Durdins weren't wealthy or adventurous. They were ordinary people, like so many others trying to find quiet moments of joy in the chaos of everyday life. At the time of the attack, they lived in Whyalla, an industrial town on the Spencer Gulf, known for its shipbuilding and steelworks. Barry had recently left a rural farm job because of a severe allergy to animal dander. They relocated closer to the coast, where the sea air was clean and the ocean offered some relief from inland dust. It was meant to be a fresh start. On weekends, Shirley loved taking the family to Peak Bay. She enjoyed being near the water but wasn't an expert swimmer. She didn't dive deep or venture far. Her snorkeling was limited to the shallows, more like wading with a mask than true free diving. But she was confident in those familiar conditions. She knew the routine. She knew where to look for scallops. She had done it many times before. Her life was centered on others. Friends described her as gentle, soft-spoken, devoted to her family. She volunteered at her children's school and often baked for local fundraisers. She was the kind of person people trusted without thinking twice, and that trust extended to the sea. To Shirley, the water was never a place of danger. It was a place of peace. It was where she could breathe, float, and find a small moment of quiet for herself while the kids played nearby. On that Sunday in March, she slipped into the shallows like she always had. Just past her knees, then her waist. Mask on. Flippers steady. Nothing unusual. She had no reason to fear. That's what makes what happened so shattering. There were no signs, no warnings, no fear in her voice. Only routine. Only calm. Until the very moment the sea betrayed her. Shirley Durdin wasn't doing anything wrong. She didn't break the rules or take foolish risks. She was simply being herself, loving her family, trusting her environment, and enjoying a quiet afternoon in the water. And in the span of seconds, everything was stolen from her. Peak Bay doesn't look dangerous. On most days, it's serene, shallow, quiet. A horseshoe-shaped inlet just south of Port Lincoln on South Australia's rugged Eyre Peninsula. The water is usually clear. The sand is soft and pale. A gentle breeze comes in from the Southern Ocean, carrying the scent of salt, eucalyptus, and warm earth. On maps, it barely registers. To locals, it's a tucked-away spot, used more by fishermen and families than by tourists. Remote, but not wild. Peaceful, but not deserted. That's what makes it deceptive, because beneath that calm surface lies something older and darker. Only a few hundred meters offshore, the shallow water drops off into sudden depth. A submerged ledge leads straight into one of the deepest continental shelf drop-offs in the region. Cold, nutrient-rich currents from the Antarctic collide with temperate coastal waters, creating an ideal feeding ground for marine life. And where prey gathers, predators follow. Peak Bay is just one piece of a much larger coastline defined by biological richness and biological risk. The region around Port Lincoln has long been known as a hotspot for great white sharks. Not because it's cursed, but because the ecosystem is perfect. The area supports massive populations of Australian fur seals, sea lions, and schooling fish. Fishing vessels routinely offload scraps into the water. In the 1980s, there were no regulations about dumping fish remains near shore. The scent of blood and offal often drifted for miles. To a shark, these weren't isolated signals. They were an invitation. At the time of Shirley Durdin's attack, several commercial abalone divers had already reported seeing large sharks in the region. Some even described massive silhouettes trailing behind their boats in recent weeks. But sightings weren't always taken seriously. After all, this was South Australia. Sharks were part of the reality, but rarely the nightmare. Port Lincoln itself, a 2-hour drive from Peak Bay, is often called the shark capital of the world. Cage diving tours began operating just years earlier. The very waters where Shirley died are the same waters now marketed for their adrenaline-filled close encounters with great whites. But in 1985, the balance between human activity and predator behavior wasn't fully understood. There were no warning signs posted, no lookouts, no active patrols, just a beautiful remote stretch of beach, and the belief that if you stayed close to shore, you were safe. That belief would die the moment Shirley did. What happened in Peak Bay wasn't just tragic. It was a reminder that in places where the ocean touches land, two worlds collide. And in that meeting place, even the shallowest water can hide the deepest danger. The great white shark is not a monster. It doesn't kill for pleasure. It doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't even hate us. But it is, without question, one of the most efficient predators nature has ever produced. And the shark that killed Shirley Durdin may have been among the largest ever seen in South Australian waters. Witnesses estimated its length at over 6 meters. That's nearly 20 feet from snout to tail, longer than a pickup truck, and easily weighing over 2 tons. One fisherman later reported that a heavy-duty shark net placed near the attack site was torn clean through, leaving a hole over 6 feet wide. This was no fluke encounter with a juvenile. This was an apex predator in its prime. Great whites, Carcharodon carcharias, have evolved over millions of years to dominate the top of the marine food chain. They're found in coastal surface waters of all the major oceans, but South Australia is a particularly rich hunting ground. Cold currents bring nutrient-rich waters teeming with prey. Seals, dolphins, rays, even large tuna. These are normal meals for a great white. But what makes the great white truly terrifying isn't just its power, it's its precision. They can detect a single drop of blood in 25 gallons of water. They can sense electrical impulses from muscle movement even in pitch darkness. They approached their prey from below with calculated silence, often unseen until the moment of impact. Their jaws, capable of exerting nearly 2 tons of bite force, are lined with up to 300 serrated teeth, arranged in multiple rows. When a white shark attacks, it doesn't nibble. It cleaves. In Shirley Durdin's case, the initial bite was catastrophic. Witnesses said she was bitten in half, severed across the midsection in a single strike. Her lower half sank. Her upper half briefly remained above water, before the shark circled back and took that too. Marine experts later speculated that the shark may have mistaken her silhouette for a seal or large fish. Others believe it was simply following scent trails from nearby fish cleaning activity and reacted to movement in its path. But this wasn't a case of curiosity or a test bite. This was predation. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. There was no recovery, no remains to study, just a flipper, and a stunned silence that fell over everyone on the beach. Understanding the shark's behavior doesn't make the loss any less horrific, but it does offer perspective. This wasn't evil. It wasn't personal. It was the ocean operating by its own rules. And Shirley Durdin, through no fault of her own, found herself in the path of one of nature's most formidable creatures. Sunday, March 3rd, 1985. 12:25 p.m. The tide was calm. The water was waist-deep and glassy. Shirley Durdin entered the shallows at Wiseman's Beach in Peak Bay, her snorkel mask secure, a mesh bag in one hand, searching the seabed for scallops. Her husband, Barry, and their children stayed back on the beach. Nearby, their friend Keith Coventry paddled gently, scanning the water. No one felt concerned. No one felt watched. 12:27 p.m. Beneath the surface, visibility was good. Shirley dove, surfaced, dove again, routine and unhurried. She was about 50 meters from shore, close enough to hear voices from the beach, close enough that if she called out, her children could hear her. And then, everything changed. 12:30 p.m. From nowhere, the water erupted. According to Keith, it happened so fast he barely understood what he was seeing. A massive, dark shape surged upward from the depths. Later, he would describe it as a torpedo, a black blur moving with terrifying speed. The shark struck Shirley from below, jaws open wide, clamping down across her torso in a single devastating blow. Witnesses on the shore, Barry, the children, Kevin Wiseman, heard a crack across the water, then saw the plume of white spray and red foam. Shirley didn't scream. There was no chance to. The shark severed her body in half at the waist instantly. Her legs fell limp beneath the surface. Keith swam toward the scene, yelling, but stopped short. The dorsal fin was still circling. Shirley's upper body floated briefly, face up, arms limp. But the shark wasn't finished. 12:32 p.m. It returned. Before Keith or anyone could reach her, the shark surged again and consumed the remaining half of her body in front of everyone. A local fisherman, Kevin Hirschhausen, had been boating nearby, about 150 meters out. He witnessed the second strike from his deck. The shark dove under his boat, then rose to the surface again to finish what it started. Within 5 minutes, there was nothing left. No body, no remains. Only blood, a torn flipper, and a silent, stunned shoreline. Keith pulled Barry back from the water's edge. Barry screamed her name. His children cried and collapsed in the sand. The nightmare was over, but the damage was done. The entire attack, from first contact to final disappearance, lasted less than 5 minutes. But it left behind a lifetime of trauma. There had been no warning, no defense, and no way for anyone, no matter how brave, to stop what had already begun. This wasn't just an attack. It was an erasure, a human life, devoured in full, in daylight, within sight of the people she loved. The beach fell silent. Moments after the attack, Shirley Durdin was gone, completely. There was no body to retrieve, no chance for rescue. Just a slick of red water spreading into the shallows, and the sobs of a family shattered in real time. Barry Durdin stood frozen. Friends had to hold him back as he screamed her name and tried to run into the surf. One witness described his voice as not human, more like something primal, raw, pulled from the gut. His 4 children huddled together on the sand, sobbing uncontrollably. They had seen everything. Word spread fast. A fisherman radioed for emergency help. Others nearby motored their boats toward the site, hoping somehow to find something, anything, left. They found nothing. Local police, state emergency services, and rescue divers arrived within the hour. A helicopter circled overhead. Search teams combed the water, the beach, the rocky edges of the bay. But the great white had taken everything. The only physical trace ever recovered was a single rubber flipper, later confirmed to be Shirley's. Shark experts from Port Lincoln were consulted. One diver reported seeing a massive tear in a shark net placed in the area overnight, over 6 feet wide, believed to be from the same predator. By sundown, the reality had settled in. Shirley Durdin had been completely consumed. This wasn't typical. Fatal shark attacks are rare, but full consumption? Even rarer. Most great white attacks are one-and-done strikes, often exploratory or mistaken identity. But this was something different. This was predation from start to finish. The horror of that distinction did not go unnoticed by authorities or the press. News outlets across Australia rushed to cover the story. Headlines were stark. Woman eaten alive. Shark attack horror in front of family. No remains recovered. Some articles debated if it was the worst shark attack in the country's modern history. Locals were stunned. A beach many considered safe, practically mundane, had been transformed into a crime scene. Residents gathered in hushed clusters outside stores and petrol stations, asking the same question over and over. How could this happen here? But even amid the panic, there was no easy villain to blame. The shark hadn't broken a rule. There had been no signs posted because nothing like this had happened in decades. Still, the weight of the tragedy demanded action. Search operations continued into the next morning. Patrols were increased. Beaches in the region were temporarily closed. And behind the scenes, another conversation began to grow louder. A call for vengeance. Some locals wanted the shark hunted, but as we'll see next, the ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily, and hunting a ghost in the open sea comes with its own dangers. The morning after the attack, Peak Bay no longer felt like a beach. It felt like a wound. Word of Shirley Durdin's death had spread across South Australia overnight. By Monday morning, the headlines were everywhere. A woman eaten alive in front of her husband and children. Entirely consumed. Nothing left to bury. And the public wanted answers. Or justice. Or both. In Port Lincoln and Whyalla, the grief was palpable. People cried for the Durdin family. Strangers sent letters, food, and prayers. But beneath the sympathy, something darker began to grow. Fear and rage. Locals were angry. How could a shark that size be so close to shore? Why hadn't authorities posted warnings? Who was dumping fish waste into nearby waters? Commercial and recreational fishermen alike knew that offal, the guts of fish cleaned at sea, had long been tossed overboard without regulation. It attracted sharks. Everyone knew it. But it had become habit. A dangerous one. Almost overnight, calls to hunt the shark grew louder. Fishermen gathered in boatyards and docks, rigging lines with heavy hooks, steel trace, and barrels of whale oil. Bait was dragged in the water. Engines roared out into open sea. Some carried rifles. Others carried only anger. They didn't know if they would catch the right shark, but they wanted blood. One of the most well-known shark hunters in the country, Vic Hislop, reportedly joined the effort. Over the next several days, multiple large sharks were caught, some over 12 feet long. But none matched the estimated size of the one seen at Peak Bay. None showed signs of having consumed a human. And still, the ocean remained silent. The shark net placed offshore on the night of the attack had been shredded, torn open in a way that only something massive could have done. A 6-meter-wide hole, investigators said. That gave the hunters a clue. The shark they were after wasn't just big, it was enormous. But the sea offers no guarantees. The hunt faded quietly after a week. The ocean gave back nothing. The shark, if it was ever still there, was never found. Some questioned the purpose of the hunt to begin with. Experts reminded the public that great whites are protected in Australian waters, that killing one won't prevent future attacks, that this wasn't murder, it was nature. But for a community reeling from one of the most brutal deaths in living memory, those answers felt cold. To them, Shirley wasn't a statistic. She was a mother, a friend, a human being who disappeared into red water while they watched. And grief, when it festers, often looks for something to strike back at, even if it swims out of reach. The water calmed, but nothing else did. For the Durdin family, life did not simply go on. It shattered. There was no body to bury, no goodbye to be spoken, no closure to cling to. Shirley had been consumed entirely, erased from the physical world. And yet, her absence became a presence, one that loomed over every room, every day, every breath. Barry Durdin, Shirley's husband, had to relive her death every time he closed his eyes. He'd watched his wife die, heard nothing, could do nothing. He later told friends the silence of it, the speed, was what haunted him most. There had been no splash, no time to scream, just a moment of peace, followed by total devastation. Worse still, 4 children had seen their mother disappear. Jason was 11, Tanya, 10, Carla, 7, Sonia, just 5. What do you tell children after they witness something like that? How do you explain that their mother is gone, and that nothing will ever be found? Grief counselors were brought in. Social workers helped arrange temporary care. The community surrounded the family with meals, cards, support. But there are no casseroles for this kind of grief. What happened at Peak Bay wasn't just tragic, it was traumatic. The image of the attack, its violence, its finality, stuck with everyone who saw it. Many of the witnesses were locals. These were not tourists who could fly home and forget. These were neighbors, fishermen, divers, and children who now lived with a nightmare tied to their own backyard. The town held a memorial service at the Port Lincoln Uniting Church. It was somber. Closed casket, of course. There was nothing to place inside it. Just photos, flowers, and silence. The pews were packed with mourners, friends, family, strangers, all trying to make sense of a loss too cruel to understand. Some locals stopped swimming altogether. Others refused to take their boats out without a firearm on board. A few demanded permanent shark nets, something the government was hesitant to implement across such a wide, remote coastline. And through it all, the Durdin family simply tried to survive. Shirley had been their center, their soft place to land. Now, her absence left Barry to raise 4 children alone, haunted by what he had seen and burdened by what he couldn't prevent. The public eventually moved on. The headlines faded. But for those closest to the pain, the loss never softened. The sea had taken Shirley Durdin in full view of those who loved her most. And while the shark disappeared into the blue, the trauma it left behind never really left the shore. Shirley Durdin's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a statistical anomaly. Australia is known for its wild creatures and dangerous waters, but even here, fatal shark attacks are rare. And the circumstances of Shirley's death made it rarer still. In the entire recorded history of South Australia, dating back to the 1800s, there have been just over 24 confirmed fatal shark attacks. Most occurred in deep waters, to spearfishers, divers, or surfers far offshore. Attacks in shallow water, close to shore, are exceedingly uncommon. Attacks where a human is entirely consumed, nearly unheard of. Before 1985, the last recorded fatal shark attack in South Australia was in 1974, when abalone diver Terry Manuel was killed near Coffin Bay. Like Shirley, he was in South Australia's Eyre Peninsula, an area increasingly known for its proximity to great white habitats. But unlike Shirley, he was diving in open water. He had some degree of risk awareness. Shirley, in contrast, was in waist-deep water, close enough to hear her children, close enough to think she was safe. It's also important to understand that while shark attacks often dominate headlines, they are, by almost every measure, statistically rare. The Australian Shark Incident Database, maintained by the Taronga Conservation Society, shows that in a typical year, there are between 20 to 30 shark attacks nationwide. Of those, 1 or 2 may be fatal. The vast majority of encounters are either non-fatal or non-aggressive. Many are considered hit-and-release incidents, where a shark bites and lets go, often believed to be cases of mistaken identity. Surfers and swimmers sometimes resemble seals or prey from below. But Shirley's case was different. There was no mistaken identity, no warning bite. This was a full, 2-stage predatory act. The shark struck, inflicted a mortal injury, circled back, and consumed the rest of her body. Marine experts confirmed this behavior aligned more with typical feeding patterns, not curiosity or confusion. That distinction between accident and attack is what made Shirley's death so shocking. It shattered the illusion that human presence near the shoreline is immune from the risks of nature. It forced scientists, swimmers, and policymakers to rethink long-standing assumptions about shark behavior, baiting practices, and proximity. And it reminded the public that nature does not recognize the boundaries we create in our minds. For decades after her death, Shirley's name continued to appear in research papers, news specials, and conservation debates. Her story became a case study, not just of predation, but of vulnerability. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Ready to move on to Chapter 11, Ethical Reflection and Lessons Learned? This next chapter will Shirley Durdin's death raised questions far beyond the immediate horror. It forced a country and the world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that nature is neither fair nor controllable, and that even in shallow water, even with family nearby, even in daylight, nothing is guaranteed. But the tragedy also sparked deeper reflection. Should sharks like this be hunted after an attack? Should humans share the ocean with such powerful predators? And if not, who truly belongs there? In the days following Shirley's death, calls for retribution echoed through South Australian communities. Fishermen scoured the waters, giant hooks were baited, shark nets were deployed, and multiple sharks were killed, none of them confirmed to be the one responsible. But this wasn't a rogue animal. It wasn't a mutated killer or a beast from the deep. It was a great white shark, doing what great whites have done for millions of years. And that's what made it so terrifying. There was no evil to destroy, no villain to punish, just a natural predator responding to its environment. So the question becomes, what role did we play in creating that environment? At the time, it was common practice for fishing boats to dump fish guts into the sea near public beaches. Cleaning stations operated without regulation. Waste drifted into areas where families swam and snorkeled. That organic matter drew sharks closer to shore, closer to humans, whether we realized it or not. Experts believe Shirley may have been the victim of circumstance. A predator already in feeding mode, possibly following a scent trail, encountered a slow-moving human silhouette near the bottom. Not a deliberate hunt, but an opportunity. That distinction matters, because if the threat is based on misunderstanding, not malice, then the solution isn't revenge, it's prevention. In the years following the attack, public safety protocols began to change. Fish waste disposal became more tightly regulated. Shark behavior research received more funding. Public awareness campaigns taught swimmers about avoiding dawn and dusk swims, staying in groups, and steering clear of fishing zones. But still, the ocean is the ocean. It is not a controlled environment. It doesn't follow our rules. And tragedies like Shirley's remind us that even with better science, better policy, and better awareness, nature can still break through. So perhaps the greatest lesson isn't one of fear, but of humility. That when we enter the sea, we're guests, temporary visitors in a world not built for us. And that every step we take into those waters, no matter how close to shore, should come with respect, with caution, and with the understanding that not everything out there can be managed. For years, Shirley Durdin's name was spoken in hushed tones across South Australia. Not just because of how she died, but because her story became a kind of turning point. A before and after moment. Before 1985, shark attacks were viewed largely as freak accidents, unpredictable, unpreventable, and isolated. But Shirley's death, seen by multiple witnesses, covered globally, and defined by complete bodily loss, was too violent to ignore, too public to dismiss. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reckoning. Her story began showing up in safety briefings, shark research papers, and diving manuals. Marine biologists cited her case when explaining the predatory behavior of large great whites. Police and emergency services across Australia updated their coastal response protocols, realizing just how fast and how total an attack could be. In Whyalla and Port Lincoln, changes came slowly but surely. Some local councils established clearer signage warning about shark-prone areas. Others restricted fish waste disposal near popular beaches, acknowledging that human habits had brought sharks dangerously close to swimmers. Abalone divers began logging shark sightings more consistently, and recreational fishers became more cautious about cleaning catches near shore. But perhaps Shirley's most lasting legacy wasn't policy, it was awareness. Her story stuck in the minds of families, swimmers, and seafarers across Australia. She was not a risk-taker. She didn't provoke the animal. She didn't venture recklessly into deep water. She was simply snorkeling in the shallows, on a sunny day, with her family nearby. That stark truth made people think differently, not out of paranoia, but out of respect. The idea that "it won't happen to me" no longer felt safe to assume. Over time, Shirley's death also contributed to a broader shift in how the public understood sharks. It helped move the conversation away from vengeance and toward coexistence. Environmental campaigns, particularly from the late 80s onward, began to challenge the monster shark narrative. Scientists emphasized that great whites weren't mindless killers, but crucial parts of the marine ecosystem. Shark netting was debated more seriously, not just for its effectiveness, but for its impact on other marine life. Shirley's name often re-emerged during those conversations, not as a warning, but as a reminder of what's at stake when we ignore how our actions ripple into wild spaces, of what can happen when respect for nature gives way to routine. She became, unintentionally, a symbol, not of fear, but of consequence. And her story continues to be told, not to instill panic, but to ensure that people entering the sea do so with eyes open, minds informed, and hearts respectful of a world that doesn't bend to human expectations. Shirley Durdin's story isn't just about what happened in the water. It's about how one ordinary day, one quiet, familiar routine, can be shattered in seconds. It's about a family forever changed, a husband haunted, 4 children forced to grow up with a memory no one should carry. But it's also about what we learn, what we change, what we remember. These aren't stories we tell for shock value. They're stories we tell to honor the people behind the headlines, to understand the power of nature and the limits of control, and to remind ourselves that even in the places we feel safest, respect for the wild must never fade. If Shirley's story moved you, if it made you reflect, we ask you to help us continue telling true stories that matter. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who should see it. Leave a comment. Not just to talk about sharks, but to talk about life, loss, and the choices we make around nature. Because the ocean doesn't forget, and neither should we.